Would you please state your full name and address?
Sam Goldstein, 230 South, 500 East, Suite 100, Salt Lake City, Utah, 84102.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey in 1952. Moved to Brooklyn, New York in 1955. Grew up there, went to school there. Came to Salt Lake City in 1976 to finish my doctorate, and I've been here ever since.
Yankees fan or a Mets fan?
I have to honor my dear departed father, a Yankees fan.
There you go. Okay. And did you do graduate work just at the University of Utah or any other universities?
I did graduate work at Montclair State in New Jersey and at the University of Utah.
Any fellowships or special training opportunities?
I'm not sure I can answer the question. I finished my degree and did a doctoral residency to sit for my license, which I did. The license is generic in the state of Utah. So your license is a psychologist and then ethically responsible to practice within the area in which you've been trained.
And you have specialty areas or interest areas in both children and adults, is that correct?
In my clinical work? Yes.
Okay.
Primarily children in my clinical work.
Okay. And tell the jury about your publications, would you?
What would you like me to tell them?
Summarize in less than 3 minutes.
My 54th book just came out. A large number of clinical textbooks that are used by other professionals, trade books for the general public. I edit a major science journal. Comes out 14 times a year on attention and related problems. It's 2,000 pages of peer-reviewed research. I've authored or co-authored a dozen psychological tests and neuropsychological tests that are used all over the world.
Tell us about some of those tests, what they show, or intended to show.
Well, the one I'm most proud of, the cognitive assessment system, is a measure of someone's critical thinking and problem solving that's independent of the effects of culture or experience. So Aboriginal children in the outback, affluent children in suburbia at the same ages test the same way. So we created that instrument to avoid the bias of children coming from underprivileged homes or minorities being unfairly identified as having disabilities in the schools.
Okay. Now, we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but I'd like you to tell the jury briefly what executive function is. Executive function.
What I think it is?
What it is scientifically in the field of neuropsychology.
Well, there's a lot of disagreement in what it is. It's become a very popular term in education now, but primarily it refers to how you do what you do. It's the strategies or behaviors you employ in solving whatever problems you have in the course of your day. Some people believe it's a variety of different kinds of abilities: memory, emotional regulation, planning. And in our research, it seems to be an overarching, a singular phenomena: how you do what you do. Anything you do to improve outcome would be an executive function. Your preparation for this trial, for my examination, would be considered an executive function, improving what you hope to achieve in my testimony. And in everyday life, it's how we do what we do.
Have you published in this area?
My co-edited textbook on executive functioning is the most widely used in the world, I'm told. And my assessment tool, the Comprehensive Executive Functioning Inventory, is standardized on the general population of children and adults, and we use it as an observational measure. So a parent would fill it out, or a teacher, or an individual, asking questions about how they do what they do. How do you plan? How do you regulate your emotions? It's different from the kind of neuropsychological testing most people think of when you think of someone sitting across a computer or face-to-face with an evaluator being asked questions or putting puzzles together, etc. This is more about how you do. It's more about behavior.
Okay. Can a person, hypothetically, score really high, a bright person, a person of some substance, education, score really high on neuropsychological testing of things like words and concepts and do really poorly on executive function.
So you mean someone like Einstein?
Einstein
Yes.
or Terry Sanderson?
Or Terry Sanderson, correct. Our neuropsychological tests measure your ability to think critically, your memory, how you go about solving problems in a controlled environment. But the relationship of those tests to real-world behavior is fairly limited. So you can be very bright, particularly if you have a brain injury to the front of your brain.
You can frontal lobe.
Yeah, orbitofrontal, the lower frontal part. You can be still very, very bright, intellectually advanced, and still have a lot of trouble in everyday life. Perseverating, going over things again and again, finding it difficult to problem solve, repeating yourself, trouble controlling your emotions. Again, you use the term executive functioning. Any behavior that you engage in to demonstrate what you know in an effective way. Knowing it isn't enough. You have to know how to execute it. You have to know how to do it.
Okay. Do people sometimes short-circuit that in common everyday parlance and saying, being able to keep 2 balls in the air, 3 balls in the air at one time?
I don't understand the question. What was the question?
Well, let's suppose that you're a juror. Some of the case. You need to come up here in the snow, in the ice, okay? Yet you have things to worry about at home, too. So you kind of juggle all these things. Executive function help you do that?
The ability to think about one thing and put something else out of your mind?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Again, any behavior you engage in, whether it's internal in your thinking or external in how you do what you do, if it improves your performance and your functioning, it falls under that umbrella.
Over your career, okay, roughly what, 1976 to the present?
So the clinic I opened with a neurologist, we opened in 1980.
Okay.
We see about 500 or 600 children and a few hundred adults every year, right through COVID. About half the people I see have brain injuries. The other half have more complicated genetic or related kinds of developmental problems. You don't want to see me. You don't want your children or any of your relatives to have to see me.
Yeah.
They're not all in litigation. I do about one litigation forensic case a week. I don't know if that's been explained to the jury, but in a forensic matter, I'm not treating. I'm simply retained, and I am a retained expert. So I like to think that I'm unbiased and I'm not an advocate, but I am retained by one side or another to offer opinions and answer questions.
How often are you retained roughly by the plaintiff side and the defense side? We're plaintiff here.
I'm asked that all the time, and my response is it doesn't matter because I'm not an advocate. My opinions will be the same, I would hope. I make that effort regardless of who I'm testifying for. I would argue, given that the rules now require me to keep 7 years worth of records, it's about even between plaintiff and defense. Correct.
Okay. Now, over the course of your career since about 1980, talking about 43 years, give or take, how many neuropsychological evaluations have been performed in your clinic?
In my clinic, by me or by myself in my doctoral residence?
Everyone.
It's roughly, as I've testified, 700 or 800 a year. Again, they're not all in litigation. It's grown. The first 10 years it was smaller. It's grown over the years, but last year it was about 700 evaluations.
We're talking about roughly, I'm just a country lawyer, okay? I'm not very smart, but I can do a little bit of math. That's talking about 16,000 neuropsychological evaluations. 700 a year times 10 is 7,000. Times 20 is 14,000?
It's a lot, yes.
Okay. And how many of those have you done personally?
I do about 200 a year, about 4 a week when I'm in the clinic. Again, they're not all in litigation, and 2/3 are children. In my clinic, in my forensic work, it's about the other way around. I think in my deposition I said it was 50-50. I think it's probably closer to 70-30 because we spend the majority of our lives as adults.
Sure.
So it wouldn't be unexpected in litigation. A significant percentage of people with brain injuries, or I might be involved, will be an adult versus a child.
Now, in all of those evaluations, all those events, 16,000 in the clinics and several thousand, multiple thousands for you personally, have you ever issued a report or done an evaluation without seeing the individual and interviewing the individual who's the center of the case? Ever?
Not in an evaluation. I've been asked to do record reviews. That's a very different matter.
So, how important is it, if you're going to get a legitimate opinion, to do a clinical meeting with the individual?
Well, and again, I don't mean to be difficult, but it matters what opinion. If I conduct a record review, the opinions I offer are the accuracy of the foundation treaters or other experts have provided in forming their opinions. So my review asks the question, does this person provide sufficient foundation, that's a term you attorneys use, sufficient facts to support the opinions they've offered? But as someone doing a record review, I can't offer my own opinion.
So, when you do a record review, you're looking at evaluating the testing done by others, right?
And the medical records and the care provided, but I can't offer my own opinion. I can disagree with the opinions of others based on what I perceive as their lack of foundation.
But you can't offer your own opinion as to the neuropsychological status of somebody without doing a clinical interview. Is that correct?
I could, but it would be both unethical and unscientific. How can I offer an opinion based on the data someone else gathered without gathering my own data? Maybe I would ask questions a little differently. Maybe I would observe the patient somewhat differently. So I can offer opinions about the opinions of others, but I can't offer my own opinions unless I actually see the person.
Okay. So, would it be true that seeing the person is important if you're going to offer an opinion in court?
About the person?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. How important? How important?
Oh, well, in my work it would be at least 99% important. Maybe in the legal arena it might be 51% important.
What is it? A minute ago you said unethical. What did you mean by that?
Well, if you're a member of the American Psychological Association, one of the standards of ethics is you don't provide independent opinions about a person unless you've seen them or there are other circumstances that might preclude you from seeing them.
Like they're dead or something, right?
Could be they're dead, could be in a forensic setting, opposing counsel refuses to make their client available.
Okay. Now, you've done a lot of medical legal work, you mentioned that. Are you familiar with the Rule 35 exam, sometimes called an IME, independent medical exam, that allows you to request to see somebody?
Your Honor, may we approach? Sure.
what percentage of your clinical practice is children versus adults? I may have covered that, but I wanted to be sure I had.
Yeah, I mentioned that. It's in my clinical practice, it's at least 2/3 children.
All right. And how often do you see victims of concussion, adults, victims of concussion?
In the clinical practice or forensic
Both.
practice or both?
Yeah.
At least someone every week. That's big part of what I do.
Okay. How is, do neuropsychologists sometimes, if they're trained, determine causation of a concussion?
Some will, yes.
And how do you do that?
Review medical records, have an understanding and appreciation of the diagnostic process, understand the symptoms of concussion, as well as understanding the liabilities of determining the causality of those symptoms and coming to a conclusion. In a forensic matter, I defer to the diagnosis of a concussion to a physician, preferably within proximity to an event. It's just easier for the jury, I think, to understand what each expert's role is.
Okay. Now, could you tell the jury briefly what information you reviewed and relied on in this case?
I don't know if I can do that briefly, but your office
Do your best.
your office provided me with a long set of records and depositions from multiple providers, both before and after this particular accident, and that's what I used. I don't look at every single record as foundation for my opinion. A few minutes ago, I explained about the importance of the foundation in terms of the facts you offer to support your opinion. There are a lot of records I received that don't have anything to do with the questions you're asking me to address. If in any way I think a record might reflect that, I will put it into my report and as foundation.
All right. Did you review medical records from the clinic in Park City?
I looked at them, yes.
Did you review the records from the medical building at the Deer Valley Ski Resort?
Yes.
Okay. Did you review the VA records?
The ones that were provided to me, yes.
Did you review Dr. Fong's records?
Yes.
Was there anything important in the Deer Valley incident report dated 2/26/16 for your opinions?
Important in my conclusion that this man was suffering the consequences of a brain injury?
Yes. Concussion, brain injury.
Yeah, he was disoriented a bit. His head cleared pretty quickly, it seemed like. Again, these are fairly cursory examinations, but there are indications in the records, and then subsequently a care provider indicates that it's their opinion that his symptoms are reflective of a concussion. And I don't question care providers. I wasn't there.
And why are those things important for you?
Well, they're more important for you than for me. In a clinical setting, I'm asked to evaluate someone and offer opinions about their problems and what might help them. In a forensic setting, I'm also asked, do I have an opinion about who's responsible or what event might be responsible? And in a chronology, from looking at all of the records and evaluating Mr. Sanderson, the one event that would appear to acutely lead to the symptoms he was presenting was this particular accident.
Ski collision.
The ski collision, correct.
Now, the day of the collision, Michael McMahon, M-C-M-A-H-A-N, a physician's assistant, evaluated Terry Sanderson, and he wrote, quote, "Patient collided with another skier," end of quote. This is an admitted record. Is that significant for you?
Again, at an event that might cause an injury to his head, any factual information that would help that would be significant. But again, I'm not determining, whether Mr. McMahon made an accurate assessment or not. I'm simply taking the record as it appears, and there are multiple indications in the records of symptoms that are consistent with a head injury.
Another thing he says, and I quote, states he lost consciousness, end of quote. Is that significant, and if so, why?
Again, it's a symptom that would be consistent with a head injury. How the patient, in this case Mr. Sanderson, was aware of that isn't in that record, so I don't know how he decided he was or was not unconscious. Sometimes people are disoriented and they consider that being unconscious. Sometimes people are in shock and they're not really unconscious. Other times they are truly unconscious for short periods or for lengthy periods of time.
He also wrote, quote, complaints of mild headache, end of quote. Is that significant for your opinions in any way?
Again, with the caveat that headaches could be caused by all kinds of phenomena, including a brain injury.
Quote, patient was unconscious for an undetermined length of time, close quote. Is that significant?
Yes.
For the same reasons you already expressed.
Yes.
Also, quote, has a sense of dullness, and dullness is in interior quotes, in the front of his head, close quote. Is that significant, and why?
Again, for the same reasons, the term dullness, fog, are interesting descriptions that people will offer when they're experiencing difficulty functioning in everyday life. Sometimes it's hard to know exactly what they mean by my head feels dull.
And it says that he states he was, quote, disoriented for a period of time after the injury. Disoriented for a period of time after the injury. Is that significant?
Yes, again, all significant that all of these could be markers of a head injury, or a closed head injury in this case.
Now, are you aware that the very next day, Mr. Sanderson's girlfriend, fiance, took him to the VA, 27th of February. Did you read those records of
Yes.
the complaints made? From memory, can you recall some of those things that were complained of? I can show them to you, but do you recall?
Well, again, he'd been a patient there on an ongoing basis.
For many years.
He had some pre-existing issues that might have made him what you refer to in your field as an asymptomatic eggshell plaintiff, meaning he had some problems that were not causing him difficulty in life, that then proceeded to cause him difficulty in life. But the description was the same types of concussive symptoms: headache, irritability, maybe a loss of consciousness, confusion, problems with concentration. Again, they could have multiple etiologies. People with chronic pain will report those symptoms. People who've been psychologically traumatized will report those symptoms. So they are indicators that something is wrong in an acute way. Over time, the conclusion has been that they are related to a brain injury.
They also did an MRI, I believe, maybe it was a CT, but they wrote in the interpretation, ventricular system discordant with mild volume loss. Do you understand those words? Discordant with mild volume loss?
Well, I'm going to have to preface this with I'm not a neurologist or a
Sure.
neuroradiologist, or I'm a neuropsychologist. He has enlarged ventricles, but he's asymptomatic for high pressure hydrocephalus. It's unclear.
And no volume loss after 7 years, right?
And no change, correct. No acute change in the brain.
He was discharged that day with a warning for, quote, mild traumatic brain injury. And then it said, parentheses, concussion, minor head injury, trauma, closed head injury. Of what significance is that?
Again, it's an indication that the treater was under the impression that these symptoms were related to a concussion or might be related to a concussion, and was cautioning him. Initially, when someone hits their head and there isn't a break in the skull or a bleed, it's referred to as a closed head injury, and typically within a few days it's referred to as a concussion, sometimes sooner. If it persists, then sometimes it's referred to as a persistent or post-concussive disorder, and if it lasts forever, which it seems to do in a small percentage of people for reasons we don't understand, we call it a persistent post-concussive disorder.
Okay. The paperwork he was given, he was told to watch for signs, quote, as long as 1 year after the injury. close quote. Why would someone be given that kind of a warning?
Again, I don't know. I didn't author that document. And I think we have to make a distinction between symptoms and consequences. So with brain injury, one of the rules of thumb is that symptoms are most present at the time of the injury, and over time those symptoms will typically remit. Consequence is different. The consequence is whatever the impact of those symptoms might be, and over time, for some people, consequences cause increasing dysfunction and increasing impairment in their lives as those symptoms disrupt their relationships, their ability to work, the quality of their emotional regulation. So again, I think what they were cautioning him is he may still see some consequences over time. We wouldn't expect, again, the majority of people with mild brain injury within a year to a year and a half are better.
Okay. Did you do neuropsychological testing, paper and pencil testing, and interviews? Well, let's just take paper and pencil testing. Did you do neuropsychological testing on Terry Sanderson?
We did a full battery of neuropsychological tests looking at his abilities. So abilities are defined as those innate differences among us. Some people have better memory, better speed of processing, better attention or organization. I looked at his knowledge, what does he know? And finally, I looked at his skill, and skill is a verb, skillfully doing things, which he was having trouble with. It's not a noun, it's not reading skill. So that's how I frame the assessment, and the tests aren't used to prove or disprove brain injury. They're not capable of doing that. They're designed to look at how he functions relative to people in the general population, or how he might function relative to people with his academic and vocational background. And in particular, in this man's case, because I was seeing him quite some time after the injury, I already had an indication, he'd been tested a number of times before, that his problems were more behavioral, emotional regulation, frontotemporal kinds of problems. I didn't expect them to show up on the neuropsychological testing.
You know, I'm looking at your test evaluation here. It's dozens of pages. Dated May, well, I think it said date of evaluation May 7 and 8, 2020.
Correct.
So about 3 years ago. Close.
Correct.
Yeah.
And quite a bit of time after his accident.
Yeah. His accident was February of 16, so about 4 years later.
Correct.
Now, generally, Dr. Goldstein, in your experience, when do you know that a person's condition is permanent in terms of time? What's the rule of thumb?
What's the condition?
Yeah, in other words, if a person isn't better in 4 years, what does it tell you about his condition?
Again, I don't mean to be difficult. Are we talking about brain injury?
Yeah, brain injury, I'm sorry.
Oh, if we're talking about brain injury, by 2 years out, you can compensate, you can learn strategies to function better, but in terms of recovery of the brain, it probably won't happen.
Okay. And do you know roughly how many tests you gave him?
Depends what you define as a test. He was asked,
Neuropsychological test.
he was asked to complete a number of self-report measures.
Okay.
Some people call those tests, I don't.
Okay.
He was asked to complete a number of face-to-face measures. Those are tests. Probably about a dozen to 15. There was one he became quite stressed that looks at his ability to process information, and we didn't do it because he became distressed about it. I think we did one measure to look at his what's referred to as effort,
Okay.
whether he's making effort, is he malingering or dissimulating. I didn't have any indication he was doing that. And the battery of tests is designed to look at his abilities, his knowledge, and then for someone in his circumstances, how skillfully he can use those two to solve whatever problems I put in front of him.
Now, you mentioned malingering. Do competent neuropsychologists, when they do a test battery on someone like this, particularly someone who's involved in litigation, okay? I don't think I don't know what stage this was in at 4 years, but are there tests built into tests to test validation? Validation. Is it a valid response?
There are two kinds of, we call validity measures, meaning is the person making decent effort?
Right.
One kind are standalone, they're specifically designed for that. I administered one of those measures to him. He passed 100%.
Okay.
There are others that are embedded within a test, meaning the test was designed for one thing, but I'm going to use it to look at something else. I'm not a big fan of those. And the way you use those, if the person performs more poorly than 99% of people, you raise some questions about whether they're making adequate effort or trying to make a mountain out of a molehill of their problems. But in Mr. Sanderson's case, in none of the previous assessments, 2 psychologists, a speech pathologist, and my assessment, no one's ever raised the question that he's not making effort. The question that's been raised is why he's so repetitive, why he's so obsessive. There's never been a question raised that he's not intellectually brighter than most people, that he doesn't have advanced academic knowledge. None of those issues have ever come up.
Bottom line, did you see any evidence of malingering, not making sufficient effort, okay, factitious disorder,
Seeking secondary gain. because
secondary
we're in litigation.
gain, any of that?
No,
Nothing.
no.
Terry. Did you review the reports of Doctors Fong, Gibby, and Bain?
Yes,
Okay. Did you review the reports at some point of Doctors Eastwold and Ashkenazi, psychologists, hired by the defense?
I read them, yes. I wouldn't consider them reports. They are record reviews.
Record reviews, right. Did you review the record reviews of Dr. Black, Dr. Esley, and Dr. Hosch?
Yes, they're physicians, so I don't take exception with their opinions.
Now, I'd like to ask you a question. Based on what you've just told the jury, do you have enough information about this case to answer these 3 questions? I won't ask you for the answer yet. Well, strike that. Can you tell me, based on your review, the things you've just told us about, what are the 3 most important things about this case that stuck out to you?
Sure, and I think I suggested to you that because human beings are complicated and lots of information comes at jurors, that when I testify, I'd like the jury to remember 3 things.
Okay, now you're giving them my secret. I want the jury to think I'm smart, not dumb. Okay?
And
so tell me what those 3 things are that you think are important for them to understand.
sure, and the first one involves common sense.
Okay?
Not to leave your common sense at the door because experts are offering all of these opinions.
Yeah.
Mr. Sanderson may have had pre-existing issues with his health, with his mood, with his brain, but there was, based on the records, an acute adverse change in his behavioral and emotional functioning. And initially it appeared to be a consequence of his physical injuries. He was in pain and quite a lot of pain, but over time it became apparent that it was more than just him being disrupted by pain. And that were it not for that particular accident, the life he was living in the 6 months to a year before, that I think the jury has heard about, would be the life he would continue to be living. So there was an acute change, not something slow and insidious over time, characteristic of Alzheimer's or white matter disease or any other progressive illness in the brain. That's one.
What does acute mean?
Happens very quickly.
Okay? What's number 2?
Number 2 is that these pre-existing vulnerabilities he had don't explain the acute change and now the long-term change in his behavior and functioning. That this is an acute, rapid downturn, and maybe he was, and I use the term, an eggshell plaintiff who was asymptomatic, and maybe those vulnerabilities, as a consequence of his injuries, made it harder for him to recover. made him more symptomatic than other people. I don't necessarily can tell you that for sure, but I can tell you that the problems he had before, his mood, his anxiety, his personality style, are not the reasons he's struggling today.
So they don't explain what he's got today, those prior things.
They don't explain the acute change in his functioning and the adverse pattern of emotions and behavior and communication he presents with in everyday life.
Okay, what's number 3?
He's not malingering. He's not, malingering means you're just faking and you know it. He's not dissimulating. Dissimulating means you're making a mountain out of a molehill. You have a little problem, and in an effort to recover or obtain some secondary gain, you make it seem like it's a bigger problem. And nowhere do I see his problem as lack of effort. He has diligently gone to the treatment providers that have been recommended to him. I know his treating neuropsychologist very well. She's an exceptional therapist, and he makes very little progress with her because of his problems.
Okay. Short tutorial, please. And you've already covered some of this, but tell the jury from a standpoint of a neuropsychologist, what is a closed head brain injury? What is an MTBI? You've heard that. With a small m and then a capital TBI.
So it's an injury to the brain that hasn't cracked the skull and doesn't tear the dura, that the head is still intact, but the brain has been injured. And I can offer a little foundation if you'd like to explain how that happens.
Please.
So the brain is connected to the spinal cord, and it just kind of floats around. And the skull evolved to protect the brain from blows like this over millions of years, not just in our species, but in earlier species. So the skull absorbs a lot of force when you're hit over the head. And that was primarily the kind of brain injuries people had until we started moving fast in vehicles. And now most of injuries that people have are acceleration, deceleration, or turning and twisting, and not so much something hitting the brain from the outside. The front of the brain rests on the cribriform plate, which is a bony part of the brain that lets the brain fit very nicely. And if the brain is moving 40 miles an hour and suddenly stops, the brain inside your head goes like this, twists around, and it rubs up against the skull, and you get particularly frontal injuries that lead to disruption in behavior, in mood regulation, in emotional regulation, in socialization. It's pretty classic and fairly common in those kinds of acceleration injuries.
Is that called a frontal lobe damage?
It's called a frontal lobe
Okay.
injury, that's correct. And the brain is probably 120 billion moving parts. It's not like a computer. Each part may be connected to up to 50,000 other parts. At any given moment, one brain cell might be communicating with 5,000 other brain cells simultaneously. We don't understand really how the brain works, and we absolutely don't understand how the mind works. The mind is this abstract creation of the physical brain, and as I've testified in my deposition, I think Terry's problems today are equally reflective of his mind and his thinking and his obsessions as they are of damage to his brain.
Now, let's suppose, I'll hold my hand out here, kind of cupped, see that? That's the skull, and inside my fist is the brain, okay? My knuckles are the front. If someone gets knocked down on a ski run and falls down and hits the snow hard, okay, is the brain going to slosh forward sometimes and strike the inside of that skull?
I'm going to first have to state that I'm not an accident reconstruction expert.
Okay.
I can tell you that any acceleration, deceleration of the head will lead the brain like a rubber ball inside a jar of liquid to bounce around. But I can't testify that the forces that were incurred in this accident were sufficient to damage the brain. That's beyond my expertise.
Okay. But you've seen people that have had injuries like that, is that correct?
Correct.
That has a sudden deceleration.
It's the most common kind of injury, and unfortunately, up until maybe 100 or 150 years ago, if you had a brain injury, you died.
Okay.
So the brain really has no way of repairing itself as far as we're aware, and the brain has no temp agency, meaning if one part of the brain is damaged as an adult, another part of the brain doesn't step up and rewire, and that's very nice pop psychology, but it really doesn't apply, especially in adults. Now, in children it may to some extent, but not in adults.
Now, we've heard the term post-concussion syndrome. Is that also one of the words or expressions that's used to express mild traumatic brain injury?
Yes, a mild traumatic brain injury is the equivalent of concussion. If your brain injury is more severe, meaning you have a bleed, you're unconscious for longer periods of time, we typically don't refer to that as a concussion. We refer to that as a moderate to severe brain injury.
In your experience, are people required to have loss of consciousness to have a mild brain injury or a post-concussion syndrome?
No. It's not just my experience.
Yeah.
It's the standard in the field.
Okay, so you've studied this, and that's something you know personally.
I know it from my clinical practice. I know it from my training. I know it from my qualifications, which are, I think, the 3 requirements for me to sit here on the stand.
I'd like to ask you about your opinions in this case. You've already given some. I don't want to be repetitive here, but on February 26, 2016, did Terry Sanderson have a concussion? In your opinion?
You're asking for my opinion or
Yeah.
my review of the records?
View of the records and your opinion.
The review of the records demonstrate he had a concussion.
Okay. Did this result in a traumatic brain injury?
His behavior over time and his treatment by others and his continued treatment today argues that it has.
And I think you've already talked about the cause. Do you believe, what was the cause in your opinion? I'm not asking who hit whom, but the cause.
The cause of his concussion?
Yes.
The forces his brain was exposed to during that event.
Now, you have noted in your deposition, you were asked a lot about his high test scores. We talked about that a little bit. Many areas, Terry scores exceptionally high, okay, on measures of intellectual experience and achievement. Is that inconsistent with having a brain injury of the kind you've described?
No.
Explain that.
Well, let's look at the foundation of what you've just asked. If an IQ test or a memory test or a measure of list learning told you everything you needed to know about everything the brain does, that would be fine. But we find that neuropsychological tests tell us something about everyday life, but they fall far short of telling us the majority. And in his case, individuals with this kind of frontal injury, and again, he may have been an eggshell person waiting to have a problem, but individuals with his kind of an injury typically have intact neuropsychological testing. You can't look at his IQ scores and argue his IQ is normal, therefore he hasn't had an injury. And the other side of it is maybe his IQ was even higher, and now it's just high. Maybe he's lost IQ. I'm not testifying to that because I don't think he's lost intelligence, or I don't think any of the neuropsych testing really demonstrates the problems he has from this accident. The problems he has from this accident are orbitofrontal, emotional regulation, behavior, socialization, impulsive responding, the kinds of stuff that you better understand if you follow someone around for 2 weeks. But I'm rarely afforded that opportunity.
How does, let's suppose that an individual like Terry or others have pre-existing problems. Let's say they get angry a little bit too easily. Okay, so they have pre-existing issues psychologically, irritability, let's say. You know, how does a traumatic brain injury, that, as you have described, affect those pre-existing problems in your experience?
It accelerates them.
Why?
It irritates them. That's a good question, but we see it in dementia, in Alzheimer's patients as well. As they age and as their brain begins to have more problems, their good qualities seem to fade away, and whatever adverse qualities they had in life seem to be amplified. We don't really understand why that is. Could be something to do with the mind as opposed to the physical brain. But it's true. If someone had a history of depression and they have a brain injury, odds are whatever depression they experience after, either from the brain injury or from experience, will be worse, and it will be harder for them to recover. If they had pre-existing ADHD, if they were impulsive and inattentive before, it would be harder for them to recover. Any vulnerability seems to be one that will increase your vulnerability to be more symptomatic in a brain injury and decrease your ability to recover.
All right, thank you. Now, with respect, there's a VA record, and it's been mentioned in this trial so far. February 2, 2016, roughly 4 weeks, give or take, prior to the ski accident. And Terry Sanderson says in that record, "I feel like an old man." And I may not be quoting that absolutely correctly. Is that relevant to this case, and does it affect your opinions in any way? Explain.
It doesn't affect my opinions.
Okay.
It reinforces my reasons for not questioning providers. It reinforces my reasons for why an evaluation has to require some face-to-face interaction. Because here we sit trying to understand what this man meant by that statement, and we try and piece together context. Oh, they were discussing his weight or his exercise or his age. But in the end, we really don't know. And for me, for a 70, what was he at the time, a 70-year-old man, to say I'm starting to feel a little old.
73.
Say he was 73 at the time?
Yeah. Well, at the time of, well, let's see.
When he was at the
69,
VA?
69.
Yeah, he was 69.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be unexpected for him to tell his physician, you know, I'm starting to feel a little old, I'm slowing down. We don't know what took place. Maybe the physician then said, well, are you skiing less? And Terry would have said maybe no. Are you doing less volunteer work? Maybe Terry would have said no. We weren't there. And my experience as a provider, because I spend the majority of my time working with people, is I don't write everything down. Every case is not a forensic matter in which I make note of every indication. They could have had a long conversation about the fact that, yeah, he was feeling old, but he was still doing all the things he did before. I don't know.
Let's suppose that the context, and we'll see this later, but in that same visit, he says, I'm eating out too much, I'm not exercising enough. Is that significant?
Significant of what?
To connect why he's feeling old.
You're going to have to ask him.
Okay.
Because, again, I don't know the context with which he offered those opinions.
All right. But that could be relevant, could it not?
It could be relevant to his post-accident problems?
No, why he's feeling old on February 2.
Oh, I see. You're making a cause and effect connection. He's not exercising, he's not eating, and therefore he says it's an indication I'm getting old. I don't have the energy to do what I did before, but I'm not depressed, which I think is something else was mentioned. Yeah, it could be relevant.
And he has a plan to deal with it.
He has a plan to deal with it according to what he tells the physician, yes.
Okay. I read in a 2010 article something about, and this was dealing with neuropsychological assessment of the orbital and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Those are a lot of complicated words. I'm a simple country lawyer. Explain to me what that means.
Front of the brain.
Okay? Very simple. All right.
Very simple. There's different parts of the front of the brain, but it's the front of the brain. The last evolving parts of our brain, the most recently evolving parts of our brain, and older animals don't have very big frontal lobes. They evolved later on, and they're the seat of rationality. So they're the logical parts of the brain, as opposed to the middle parts of the brain, which are more emotionally driven. Babies are born like Klingons. 2-year-olds look like they have bipolar disorder because it's the middle of the brain that runs the show for them. And maturation is about the front of the brain both myelinating, the nerves growing sheaths so they fire properly, but also about acquiring the knowledge to think before you act and not just always brain dance, which is a term I use, to act just on emotion.
Now, if this article hypothetically says that paper and pencil tests of these areas do not capture the range of real-world abnormalities exhibited by these patients. These tests don't capture the real-world abnormalities exhibited by these patients. What does that mean to you, and is it significant in this case?
Well, it's significant in this case, and it's what I've just testified to, and that is, and you're using the term paper and pencil, I would prefer to say the battery of neuropsychological tests, not the questionnaires completed by family members, because one of the things I do as part of an assessment is I always want to talk to a family member, if it's the parent of a child or a teacher or a spouse, because particularly in this kind of a problem, the way the person sees themselves is often not the way other people see them, and that person is often confused about why other people don't want to talk to them or be with them or respond the way they do to them because their insight is limited, another limitation of a front of the brain injury.
Okay. You were asked about the VA assessments done I think before and after Terry's ski crash. Are your opinions in contradiction with those of the VA people that looked at him? Why or why not?
Looked at him immediately following the accident?
Well, yeah, within the next year and a half.
No, they're relative to this matter. I don't have an opinions about his other medical problems, but relative to this matter, they're not different. No.
Okay. In your opinion, what effect did the ski collision and what happened to him there have to do with his stress and anxiety?
Well, I think two things happened to him. I think one, that, and we've already talked a little bit about it, this was a man who was talkative, boisterous, a little over the top at times, and that pattern, because of his frontal lobe injury, accelerated to the point where after 15 minutes it's hard to have a conversation with him because he's repetitive and goes around in circles, and he's very bright and very intellectual if you're discussing some intellectual matter, but when you're discussing his state of affairs, his personal life, he obsesses about it. And the second thing I think that's happened to him is his mind, meaning the way he comes to think about what's happening to him in his life. And some of that may be from brain injury, some of that's just his lifetime personality style, but he has become obsessed with trying to return himself to the level of functioning he perceived he had before this accident. And I make no judgment.
Doing what now? Say that again.
His assessment of the life he had before.
He's obsessed with getting back to that.
He's obsessed with getting back to that. He and I had a discussion that not every problem he encountered in everyday life, when he couldn't remember where he put his keys, not every problem was a consequence of injuries suffered in this accident. Some of that was just normal aging. For me, the primary consequence was his emotional and behavioral regulation, and then the impact it had on his mind, his perception of who he is and who he was. From his view, he is not the person he was. From his view, he has lost Terry Sanderson. And this is what he said to me at one point when I interviewed him.
Okay, now, is there any cure for a concussion. Is there any cure for a mild traumatic brain injury?
Cure meaning a treatment that makes it get better?
Yeah.
Not as far as I'm aware. No, there are treatments that can help you recover acquired knowledge, which is different from ability. There are activities that could help you make more of whatever you have, improve your memory, as it were. But we don't really know of any way to force the brain to heal itself. Again, as I've testified, it's not an arm or a leg. Evolution doesn't afford the opportunity by natural selection for people whose arms were injured and healed better to then have offspring, and others who didn't to not have offspring. In this case, people with brain injuries up until just recently in history died. So the brain doesn't really know how to heal itself.
Now, this kind of a mild traumatic brain injury, is it going to show up on every MRI you do?
No.
Why?
Well, from my view, the MRI is like looking at the moon with binoculars.
Okay.
You're not looking at a cellular level. You're not evaluating how brain cells fire, how many dendrites are connected to how many other dendrites, how axons work. I think Dr. Gibby testified some to that. But again, we're talking about a system of over 100 billion moving parts.
Does Terry seen a psychologist at the VA, well, I don't know if it's at the VA or not, named Siebers? Are you aware of that?
Terry sees
Yeah.
Dr. Siebers. She's a board-certified neuropsychologist. She sees him in counseling. Dr. Siebers works for Intermountain Healthcare.